I got vacation brain. Listeners, in case this makes it to the cold open, I was just about to start recording the podcast without pressing record, but Eric just saved this entire audio recording.
Saved the day again.
Eric, thank you.
What a hero.
Hello and welcome to the GD Politics Podcast. I'm Galen Drake. It looks like the backlash to Trump is going global. In the US, Trump's popularity hit a low of about net negative 10 percentage points right as he clocked 100 days in office. But abroad, the political impact of Trump's first 100 days is perhaps more tangible. In both Canada and Australia, the Liberal parties, which looked destined for defeat just months ago, came roaring back. A week ago, Canada's Liberals won the most seats in Parliament in the country's national election, ensuring that Prime Minister Mark Carney would serve the Liberals' fourth consecutive term in control of government. The party came just shy of a majority, meaning they'll rely on votes from other parties to pass their agenda. But even that performance was unimaginable at the start of the year, when the party was polling at a 24-point deficit on average to the Conservatives. And over the weekend, Australia's Labour Party secured a second term for Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, expanding its majority in what Australian analysts have been calling a landslide. Just 2 months ago, Australia's Conservative Party, the Coalition, was leading in the polling averages. In Canada, Trump played an explicit role in the campaign after suggesting an annexation of the country. In Australia, his role was less explicit, but the turnaround in fortunes for the center-left is a difficult story to tell in either country without the Trump factor. And in both countries, the conservative leaders who got compared to Trump lost not just the election, but their own seats in Parliament. I would have jumped on the Canadian result sooner had I not been on vacation, but better late than never, as we say. So joining me today are the two Canadian analysts I knew I had to call when the election was first scheduled. Author of the Writ, Eric Grenier. Welcome back to the podcast, Eric.
Happy to be here.
Also here with us is author of 338 Canada, Philippe Fournier. Welcome back to the podcast, Philippe.
Good to see you again, Galen.
And I will again mention that you co-host the podcast The Numbers, or Les Chiffres, because it's in both French and English. You are Canadian election experts, so maybe this question is a little unfair, but it's also hard to ignore the past weekend's results in Australia. Philippe, do you think it's fair to draw a Trumpian through line, as I did in the introduction?
Well, to some extent, yes. I mean, the world, the Western world, and I know Australia is not the West, but it's Western enough. You know, there's many parallels we can draw. And we've seen what the uncertainty and the chaos caused by the Trump administration in the U.S. You know, globally, there's people who recoil from that. And I think people on the center and center-left can sometimes mend their differences against a common opponent. And I think that's what we saw, at least partially in Australia, and that's what we saw in Canada as well.
Yeah, I think that, while neither of us are experts in Australian politics, you do see the similarities that this was a party that was trailing in the polls. It seemed to be in a lot of trouble, that it wouldn't get reelected. The opposition party, which was a more conservative party, which would be more aligned to Donald Trump and the Republicans, at least in ideology, at least in worldview, in some extent, doesn't adjust and gets trounced by the center-left party, which is more willing to take on Donald Trump. I think the biggest difference, though, between the two is that Canada has been directly impacted and threatened by Donald Trump and the U.S. administration. Australia, in other ways, in the same way that other countries have been, and also, adding Canada to the Donald Trump's map of risk. Looks a lot better than trying to get Australia, which wouldn't really make it, doesn't. What did he say, that the map looks beautiful if the continent was all one? I guess Australia is just a bit too far to get included into that.
Yeah, I've seen analysis of the Australian election that did emphasize this difference in that in the Canadian election, the United States and Trump was a very explicit part of the campaign, whereas it was less explicit in Australia, but there's still some suggestion that Trump played a role. And I'm curious if it just has something to do with being large English-speaking countries. I know, Philippe, the last time we talked, you bristled at my mention of being a part of the Commonwealth, et cetera, et cetera. But is it easier for American politics to get transferred into other English-speaking countries than, say, I don't know, for example, Germany, which also had an election post-Trump where conservatives did just fine?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, we all consume a lot of the same media. I don't really know what the Australian media landscape is like, but a lot of Canadians consume a lot of U.S. media. Oh, yeah. A lot of our, the top TV shows are American made. Our top private network in Canada, CTV, runs mostly or a lot of, top Canadian. Like if you want to watch Grey's Anatomy or something, you watch it on CTV or Global or whatever it is. I can't recall. But we watch a lot of American media and we consume a lot of American news. I imagine that in Australia, that is also the case, maybe less so because obviously we have less in common in terms of whatever's impacting one place or the other. But I do think that penetration of the American news cycle into Canada and into English-speaking places in general has a huge impact. And I think we saw that in the last election, where anytime that Donald Trump said something, it usually made news here. And when you look at the time in the campaign, when Donald Trump was the quietest, when he wasn't making the most noise regarding Canada, that is when things were going maybe the poorest for Mark Carney and the Liberals, that it wasn't giving them the oxygen that it was at the beginning of the campaign when we had the tariffs and we had the back and forth on whether they were being applied to Canada or not. So definitely, I think that the linguistic bridge is easier than it would be in, as you said, France or Germany or places where, the Americans are the Americans. Like, they're a very different kind of animal than what we are here.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of the American, Philippe, you're coming to us from, a French-speaking part of Canada. That's Do right. you think that there was any difference in how Quebec voted as a result of primarily speaking French?
Well, not this time around. I would say usually yes. And what Eric said about media consumption, Quebec has its own microsystem of media, right? We do have the American media, but it is not what people watch here. We have our own star system. We have our own singers and our own artists.
Yeah, I've heard of Celine Dion.
Yeah, she went global. But
doesn't she live in like Las Vegas now?
Yeah, she does. But the thing is, we have like our award show in Quebec of French-speaking singers and French movies, and we have a microsystem here, and the same goes with media. So although we do see, of course, media has no borders now with the internet, but the consumption is different, and it's strange. I would say that for a rare time, Quebec voted pretty much in line with the rest of the country, right? There's the Bloc Québécois, of course, it's always there. But the Liberal Party in Quebec got 43%. And in Canada, as a whole, got 44%. And so there was, I think, a little realignment in Quebec that seemed to be that Quebecers were more aligned with the rest of Canada, and something that we haven't seen much in the last decades.
Okay, well, speaking of the Commonwealth, just very briefly before we dig into the nitty-gritty of Canada's election, you all told me that King Charles's role as the Canadian head of state is an afterthought in modern Canada, and that the majority of Canadians would support becoming a republic if it was a straightforward process to do so. But Mark Carney, as one of his first acts as a re-elected prime minister, seems to be leaning into King Charles's role as the Canadian monarch, because the Liberal government's roadmap will not be read by the Governor General when the new Parliament begins in late May. Instead, it will be read by King Charles in his capacity as the King of Canada. And this is for the first time since 1977. Yeah. So, Philippe, what's going on here? Did you steer me the wrong way?
Well, okay. I'm glad you brought this up, and I see Eric is smiling here. I'm sure he has an answer, but okay. So the fact that King Charles will come here and read a script doesn't change the fact that most Canadians would put away the monarchy for good if they could, if it was straightforward, as you said. But There's something with Mark Carney that the 1 week he was prime minister before he went into the election, what did he do? He went to France to meet with Emmanuel Macron. Then he went to the UK with Mr. Starmer, the prime minister. Then he went to the north to meet with First Nations and Inuits. And so it looks like the founding people of Canada, the symbolism is really important. And so I think while we can roll our eyes, the fact that the king is coming here to read a script, I think it does send a message. And I think the Bloc Québécois, of course, their sovereignties, they're appalled by the fact that the king is coming. I don't see here in Quebec people being angry about this. So maybe it's just to send a signal of sovereignty and independence towards the US. Or also, there are Canadians that like the monarchy. They think it's part of their history. And so perhaps it's like extending an olive branch to these people.
Well, then, Philippe, it's exactly what I said it is, which is that when Trump talks about annexing Canada, he's talking about going to war with the United Kingdom. See, I knew I would be proven right eventually, Philippe. Because otherwise, why would you invite the King of England to prove your sovereignty as the nation of Canada?
Eric, take this one.
So it is a bit of a puzzle. It's interesting though that Philippe just said there are some Canadians that are monarchists, and the Liberal coalition that just won an election was predominantly older, and older people do have a bit more of an attachment to the monarchy in Britain. And there's another thing to point out. Philippe just mentioned that it's not like there's a huge amount of anger in Quebec about this. It's because the main defining character of Canadians' relationship with the monarchy is apathy. We mostly just don't care. Yeah. When we say like if our majority of Canadians are Republicans in the sense of wanting to get rid of a monarchy, if you ask Canadians in a poll, you usually get 60-70% who say they would get rid of it. Or usually a bit less, maybe. It depends. It depends on how it's worded. But it's mostly that we don't really care. So it's not really a top issue or anything like that. I do think that one of the reasons why the king is being asked to come to read the speech from the throne and to explain it to Americans, whenever a new parliament opens, the governor general, who is supposed to be the representative of the crown in Canada, reads the government's agenda. More or less reads, the State of the Union in the United States. Instead of the prime minister reading it, it's the governor general who reads it. It's very strange, but the governor general will refer to it as my government. My government is going to do this, even though the GG has no role in writing the speech. So the king will have to read this speech instead. It is worth noting that I think his French is actually pretty good and much better than the governor general's, who it was a bit of a controversy because she didn't speak French when she was appointed. But I think one of the reasons why it might be seen as a good idea is that Donald Trump seems to like the monarchy. He seems to respect it in some way. So maybe as a reminder that, King Charles is technically the king of Canada while also being the king of other countries. There's some pedantic people here who will always say, no, it's not a foreign monarch. He's the king of Canada, even though he wasn't born in Canada, is not from Canada or has any role in Canada. But I do think that there is
he's also not that English, right? Aren't they a German family?
Yes, yeah, that's right.
Don't ask me.
Don't talk about the war. So anyway, I do think there's an element of just trying to remind Donald Trump, and it'll get his attention more than the governor general reading a speech would have, which doesn't get much attention here.
Okay, now let's get to what you came here to do, which is talk about the nitty-gritty of Canada's election. How did the results compare with expectations heading into Election Day?
Well, okay. So the polls were pretty good. They were excellent even. But they were not perfect. And the same way that in an American election, especially a presidential election, it's the local data, the state-by-state polls that matter the most. In Canada, when we have a first-past-the-post system, it's the regional data that matters the most to have seat projections and estimates. And if we go region by region, I was amazed how good the calls were. Atlantic Canada was perfect. Quebec was perfect. British Columbia, which gave us a lot of headaches for past years and the past few months for sure was almost bang on. Same thing for the prairies. But then we get to Ontario, the most populous province, the province with the most seats. And the Conservatives basically matched their best polls in the province, whereas the Liberals basically hit the target. And so the end result, and Eric can correct me here, but the end result is that the Conservatives got 2.5 to 3 points more in Ontario than what the polling averages suggest. And since this is being Ontario is the place where there are the most seats, those 2.5 to 3 points flipped 15 to 20 seats. So if you look at the national picture, both Eric and I had the Liberals winning in a 180 range, and they had 169. That seems like a miss, but when you go region by region, everything is perfect except Ontario. So the polling miss, even though I don't want to call it a miss because it was within Mo, was aligned with the seat projections. Eric, how did I do there?
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And if you look at the areas that were predominantly missed, there was two that you would highlight. One would be parts of southwestern Ontario, and notably the ones that are closest to the U.S. border. So you saw that in Windsor, which is just across from Detroit. You saw in Hamilton, which is getting closer to Buffalo, and in Niagara area as well. That the Conservatives kind of overperformed. So there was something happening there with those kinds of voters, maybe blue-collar voters, which might have in the past voted for the left-wing NDP. In this case, were maybe actually voting more conservative than kind of sticking with their progressive cousins, the Liberals. And then in this area that is north of Toronto, that is a very diverse area. There's a lot of South Asian community in these ridings in Brampton and York region north of Toronto. There was a huge movement toward the Conservatives there, and it does seem like for those voters, they're primarily motivated by things like crime, cost of living, housing. So the issue with the United States and all that really wasn't having much of an impact for those voters, and they went to the Conservatives. And as Philippe said, if that didn't happen, the Liberals probably would have won that majority.
Oh, no, without a doubt. I agree.
Yeah, actually, when we talked right after the election was scheduled, Eric, I think you said that one of the biggest differences with polling in Canada versus the United States is that error is not correlated. And it seems like that played a very important role in the results compared to the polls, because if there was a nationwide miss similar to what you saw in Ontario, there would have been a big problem for the polls, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
100%.
Like, yeah, the Liberals did, the Conservatives actually underperformed the polls in Quebec by a little bit. In some parts of the country, like in Alberta and Saskatchewan, the Conservatives really beat their polls. But this is areas where they already win all the seats, so it didn't really make much of a difference. So, yeah, you do see how in Canada that error is not correlated because the voters in each region are very different. And in some cases, the NDP dropped further than we expected. In some areas, there was the Green Party that didn't have enough candidates to really register in the polls. So that vote suddenly got liberated and some of it went to the Liberals. Because one of the weird things about this is that, yes, the Conservatives were underestimated by about 2 points across the country. The Liberals were also underestimated by about a point. So in the aggregate nationally, the error in the margin between the two leading parties was only about a point and a half, which isn't that much. So it kind of shows how it's a bit more complicated. Whereas in the States, if Trump beats his polls by 2 points, that means the margin is 2 points bigger or even worse, because then the Democrats would drop more. So it's all the different moving parts. It's like a 3D game of chess a little bit when it comes to trying to guess the polls.
And if I may add on, Eric, something that we had discussed prior to the election was how bad the New Democrats did. I mean, I just was poring over the map over the weekend as a hobby this time, right? I'm just going over the map and see all these former NDP seats where the NDP finished third and had barely over double digits. I'm like, oh, this is a complete tank. This party is going into a hard rebuild, and it may take a decade or more to recover. So we hadn't had a two-party election to that level in something like 60 or 70 years in Canada. The main parties had almost 85% of the vote, which is, I mean, they had 67% of the vote last time around. This is a huge shift of paradigm.
Yeah, I'm curious why that is. I mean, a statistic that stuck out to me is that the Liberals and Conservatives combined had their highest share of the two-party vote since 1958. and that this was the first time since 1930 that they both earned more than 40% of the vote. So in some ways, the story is third parties dying out. Why was that?
Well, if I may start, Eric, I'll let you have the NDP, but I'll talk about the Bloc. The Bloc Québécois, the nationalist party that only runs candidates in Quebec, did okay in the end. They had losses. They lost 10 seats, which is significant, but they had just under 28% of the vote, where in the middle of the campaign, it looked like they would do much worse. The thing is, the Bloc Québécois is also a none of the above party for many Quebecers. They look at the slate of candidates from the Liberals, from the Conservatives, from the New Democrats, and if they don't like it too much, they go like, I'll vote for the Bloc Québécois. It'll defend Quebec interest in their best capacity. And after the debates, when the Bloc Québécois was in the low 20s in the polls, the leader of the Bloc started campaigning by saying, well, we all know Mark Carney is going to win. So he's going to win, so give us a voice so we can at least work with him and oppose him when he does something that we don't like. And that strategy seems to have paid off. They, as I said, they went back up in the polls around 28%, and they saved the furniture because they had 23 seats in the end. In the middle of the campaign, both Eric and I had the Bloc much lower than that.
Yeah, for the other parties, so Canada has had a multi-party system since the 1920s. We used to just have the Liberals and the Conservatives. It was red versus blue kind of thing, although it's the opposite, red versus blue.
It's the right colors, actually.
Yeah, it is actually, yeah. Anyway.
Shots fired.
Yeah. We saw, so we have like there was a left-wing party called first it was the CCF, then it became the NDP. It's called the New Democrats, but it's actually been called the New Democrats since 1961, just to give people an idea. And we've had some other parties that would be further on the right. So what we saw here is that those parties just disappeared. The NDP got the worst result they've ever gotten. 6.3% of the vote is their worst result. They're usually somewhere in the 15 to 20%. So they just kind of tanked. And it's because of two reasons. One, they had really nothing to say when it came to Donald Trump because they had really no believable message in terms of them being the negotiating, that they were actually in contention to form government. And so they were just kind of out of that conversation. The other is that a lot of their voters were opposed to Pierre Poilievre. Pierre Poilievre was seen as a bit too right-wing, a bit too partisan. He wanted to do things like defund the CBC, which is our Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, our main TV, our public TV airwaves and radio. And a lot of those voters just wanted to make sure that Pierre Poilievre didn't win. And so they supported the Liberals. So the NDP was getting it from really, they also lost a lot of their more working class voters to the Conservatives. So they were getting it from all sides and they were just completely out of the conversation. Their leader, Jagmeet Singh, has not been very effective for the last few years, but I think was being propped up and floated a little bit by the unpopularity of Justin Trudeau. And then we have the other two parties that completely collapsed. The Green Party, which has been in a spiral, really self-inflicted wounds over the last 5-6 years. They used to be able to get 5-6% of the vote in elections. In this one, they got 1.3. So they were completely out of it, and a lot of that vote went to the Liberals. And then we also had the People's Party, which was a right-wing, much further right-wing party, kind of anti-immigration. During the pandemic, there were like anti-vaxxers and all this kind of stuff. And they had got nearly 5% of the vote last time. And this one, they dropped to less than 1%. Yeah. And that vote all went to the Conservatives. So these parties just kind of got completely pushed out of this polarized race between the Liberals and the Conservatives. And yeah, like you said, hasn't been since 1930, then both parties had over 40% of the vote. Like that's over 100 years, almost 100 years. Like it's just, the question we have is this a one-off or is this the beginning of something new? And that's always hard to say because Canadians can fly all over the place when it comes to elections. Oh, yeah. We don't stick around from one vote to the next.
Yeah, I think Australia saw a similar trend from what I understand. And also the re-election of an incumbent, which flies in the face of basically everything we've seen globally for the past decade or so, which is a real anti-incumbent attitude amongst voters and some deterioration of the sort of historical post-war center-right, center-left polls in a lot of Western democracies. Can you chalk that all up to Trump?
I think one, yes, that's part of it. But also, Mark Carney wasn't really seen as an incumbent. I think that helped a lot, that he was seen as a departure from Justin Trudeau, and he's tried to separate himself from it. We saw actually one, I think it was a post-election poll that was done, and it said if Justin Trudeau had still been the leader of the Liberal Party, what would the result have been? And it was more or less almost still a 20-point lead for the Conservatives. So it does kind of show that there was... It does kind of show that Justin Trudeau himself was a big factor in it. But I think that Carney was so successful in part because of the contrast he had against Donald Trump. But he also tried to make a contrast between him and Justin Trudeau, and it seems that worked.
Well, was there ever a moment akin to what we saw in the American election when Kamala Harris was on The View and they said, what would you have done differently than Joe Biden? And she said, well, nothing really comes to mind. I'm paraphrasing. Did Mark Carney more audaciously break rank or sort of, break with Justin Trudeau's agenda?
Well, during the debate, he was asked this very question, and I think he was asked in both French and English. And the first debate was in French, and he started his answer by saying, Justin Trudeau and I have pretty much the same values. And then there was an awkward silence. What people were wondering, okay, and what else are you going to say? Basically, he meant that, I'm not going to go after gender equality. I'm not going to go after all this, populist nonsense. He followed this answer by saying, but I'm much more focused on building the economy. I'm much more focused on, trying to make Canada more sovereign for our resources and be less dependent on other countries. And then he said something like, again, I'm paraphrasing, that it seems that Justin Trudeau wasn't too interested in that. And people held
right under the bus.
Yes, exactly. People held their breath when he said we have the same values, and the answer was reprinted everywhere the next day in French newspapers and websites, and I think it really did help him to set the stage. Like, I'm not gonna rattle the cage on social issues, but I will be focused on the economy, and my predecessor wasn't.
Yeah, like he had at one point during the debates, he said to Pierre Poilievre, who was continuously just kind of saying that Carney was part of the Trudeau government or was aligned with it. And Carney said, I know you desperately wanted to run against Justin Trudeau, but he's not here anymore. So he did definitely try to separate himself from the former prime minister. And it's worth noting that the first thing that the government did when they came in was they canceled what was seen as one of the signature policies of the Liberal government and one of the most unpopular ones, which was a carbon tax, a tax on pollution. And it was a very divisive kind of thing, and it was a very complicated policy, so we don't need to get into that. But Trudeau did not want to abandon it as a way to fight climate change. Carney, on his first day, he got rid of it because he wanted to make sure that demarcation was made between the Liberals of Trudeau and the Liberals under Carney, that when something's unpopular and is not really working in the way that it's supposed to, that they would abandon it. So I think that we definitely, it's not the same, I don't think at all with Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, where there wasn't that willingness to try to separate the two.
Completely removing the carbon tax from the election. And, the Conservatives printed T-shirts and hoodies about the carbon tax, and suddenly all that merch had to go to the garbage. So it really undercut the Conservatives.
Today's podcast is brought to you by you, the listener. I'm in the early stages of getting this podcast off the ground, and it will only succeed with your support. I want to bring you coverage that embraces curiosity, rigor, and a sense of humor. And I want to bring it to you on a regular basis with more episodes, more insight, and more laughs. I can only do that if you subscribe to and support this podcast. Go to gdpolitics.com and become a paid subscriber today. Even better, do it right now. gdpolitics.com, that's G as in gosh, D as in darn, and politics as in that hot mess. Head to gdpolitics.com to subscribe, and thank you. When it comes to defining what motivated Canadian voters in this election, do you all have exit polls that you can look to understand how they ranked the issues? Trump versus the economy, cost of living stuff versus, some of the social issues you mentioned versus immigration. Do you have a breakdown like that, like we would have in the United States?
We don't have exit polls the way you do in Canada, but we're 1 week removed now from the election, and the prominent firm here, Léger, did publish a poll this weekend, and it asked, in the end, which of the following issues or topic was most important in driving your vote? And in first place, by a wide margin, was the tariffs, Donald Trump, and U.S. aggression of Canada. 29%. Inflation, which was until very recently so high in the polls, only 11%, healthcare 7%, and everything else is in single digits. So it doesn't seem to be overwhelming, but it was the number one issues unquestionably.
I think one of you wrote somewhere, because I was looking over your fabulous writing from the past week plus. Go subscribe to the Writ and 338 Canada. Somebody wrote, maybe Liberals would have lost if this election lasted another week or something like that. Was there a sense that the Trump effect was fading by the end of the campaign?
Yeah, I think it was, because you saw at the beginning of the campaign, in the first couple of weeks, the Trump issue, tariffs, would be rising as an issue. And at some point, in some polls, it would displace cost of living concerns. But then we saw as the campaign wore on, especially by the third or fourth week, that the issue was kind of drifting away, and it was starting to get more towards the cost of living. And I do think it was as simple as he wasn't making news in Canada. He hadn't said anything about the 51st state. There wasn't any new tariffs that were put on Canada. There was, I think, the collapse of the stock market, which obviously impacts Canadians, and that still kept things as top of mind. But I do think that the Liberals did seem to be losing a little bit of focus as the campaign went on, because they had to kind of talk about other things. And there was a lot of criticisms of the Liberal campaign from commentators here, that they seemed to be losing the focus on the main issue, and the main issue was Donald Trump. And we did see at the tail end of the campaign that the polls got closer. At the height of the Liberals' kind of support during the campaign, they were ahead by 6-7 points, 6 or 7 points nationwide. By the end, the polls were about 3 to 4 points. And in the end, the margin ended up being a little over 2 points. We definitely did see that as the campaign became less about Trump, that Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives were able to make some inroads.
And I would say also that if the Liberal strategist that I spoke to at some point says we took the lead too fast. And of course you can't control that. But the Liberals spent much of this campaign in the lead, and so eyes were on them. The scrutiny was on them. It's much harder to run a campaign that way. It's there's always this good narrative of being the underdog and coming back in the end. As I said earlier, also Yves-François Blanchet, the leader of the Bloc Québécois, openly saying, "Oh yeah, of course Mark Carney is going to win. We all know this." And it's like, yeah, well, we don't know this, but it was part of his spin, and it seems to have been to have worked.
Well, it's also easier to run a campaign when you yourself get to pick when the election happens.
True.
So in political systems like yours and other Commonwealth countries, the governing party gets to decide the election date within certain parameters. So I believe in Canada, this election had to happen by sometime in October.
Right.
I'm curious if there's any pushback to that as being somewhat undemocratic. Like, it's no secret that Mark Carney wanted to hold this election as soon as possible after Trump took office because of the sort of 51st state comments and Liberals sort of getting some, rocket fuel as a result of that and the change from Justin Trudeau to him. So being able to time an election in order to best capitalize on a positive news cycle for you, coming from a different political system, sounds like it could be not great for minority or opposition rights.
Let me take this one, Eric. The thing is, what you're saying, Galen, is true. There is an advantage of being the incumbent and setting the calendar, but I cannot tell you how many MPs and Conservative staffers were screaming, "Let's have an election as soon as possible," throughout January and February and then March. And then suddenly, it's so undemocratic that the Liberals get to call the election now. And it's fair game. When it's okay. If the roles were reversed, we remember in the early aughts, the roles were reversed. Prime Minister Harper, a Conservative, set the agenda, and the opposition party was like, "Well, this is undemocratic." So I I don't know. It's not that big of a deal for me, especially when you consider we have parameters. Like they can't do anything they want. There's still some rules that you have to follow. But Eric knows more about decorum than I do. So
Yeah, well, like it used to be that there was no rule at all. It just had to be constitutionally an election had to be held within 5 years of the last one, because that's when Parliament would expire. And generally, governments went around the 4-year mark, but they did do it whenever they wanted. Over the last 10, 15 years, laws have been implemented that have fixed date election laws that say that the election should be every 4 years in whatever date. Different provinces choose a different one. But the thing is, those laws have no... They're almost like suggestions.
Yeah,
and so
they are.
Governments generally do what they want. Sometimes the idea is that the political pressure will be too high for them not to abide by the fixed election date. But we just saw earlier in the year, Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, called an election a year early, a year and a half early, more or less, and it did not matter. The opposition parties were trying to make it into a thing that he was trying to take advantage, and people didn't care. I think it's all context. I think if the message is that the election should happen because there's a good reason for it, then I don't think Canadians care. When Canadians think that it is just political calculation, then there can be some blowback, and we have some famous cases in Canada of a party calling an early election to try to take advantage of good polls, and it blows up in their face. But I think that for Carney, it was a pretty clear argument. I'm new. I need my own mandate. Trump's causing lots of trouble. Let's get a new government in place. And I think Canadians bought that.
And also, Galen, if I can push back a little bit on, your system with absolutely fixed election date
This is not a podcast about the problems with American democratic structures. Philippe, come on.
You have no idea how much every year or second year where we say, the government is shut down because we can't pass a budget. Okay, in every other democracy, you can't pass a budget.
Government falls.
Government falls, and you have an election. But you guys close your parks. But okay, so.
But also in other countries, you just don't have a government at all. How long did Belgium go without having a government? What was it, 500 days?
Let's come on. Let's talk. We're talking about real countries here. Come on.
Yo. That's not me. Ce n'est pas moi. Je n'ai rien dit sur la Belgique. So, parfait.
Okay. We could just keep going. Random countries could keep catching strays here. We go long enough. But I am curious, speaking of ways in which the American political system gets critiqued for being undemocratic, how did popular support versus seat share net out in this past election? I know Liberals have been overperforming their popular support in terms of seats obtained recently. Did that continue?
This was one of the better ones.
Yeah.
There wasn't too much unfairness in terms of the seats versus the only one is the NDP should have gotten more seats, even with 6% of the vote, than what they got. But this one was one of the least distorted results that we've seen in a little while. If the government would have gotten a majority government, 43, 44%, that would have been pretty normal for Canada. Usually if you get over 40%, you get a majority, which is one of the reasons why it was such an odd election, that you had two parties over 40% and getting their best results in decades, and neither of them winning a majority government. So in terms of this one, it wasn't too unfair. I wouldn't say it was too distorted compared to some past elections.
That means that the Liberals are going to rely on votes from other parties in order to pass any of their agenda. So what should we expect this Carney Liberal government to look like? What can they pass? What can they accomplish? And how does a sort of coalitional government or a minority government in Canada fall apart?
This is a strange case, and Eric is the historian here, so maybe he knows precedent. I know precedent in my lifetime. And at the federal level, this is the strongest minority we have seen in a long, long time. Like the threshold for majority is 172, and the Liberals won 169. And it looks like they may convince somebody of the opposition to be speaker, so that's one less opposition MP against you. It could be Elizabeth May, leader of the Green, but that's not confirmed. But I flipped the narrative on this. Basically, to take down the Liberals in a confidence vote, every party will have to take all of their MPs and agree to and vote in a way that they beat the Liberals by 2 votes. That is incredibly stable for the Liberals. This is just as good as a majority. If the Liberals had won...
It's just as good as a majority in terms of holding on to power, or it's just as good as a majority in terms of passing legislation?
Oh, well, I would say both. I mean, they will have to talk to other parties, which I think many Canadians won't mind. But in order to survive, to pass a budget, to pass important legislation, you will have the left wing, or what's left of the left wing New Democrats, agreeing with the Pierre Poilievre Conservatives, agreeing with the Bloc Québécois. I mean, they all have to agree to take down the Liberals. And so the Liberals can say, well, we have many dance partners to go with. But if, just to finish the point, is that if the Liberals had won 173, right? Just above the threshold for majority, I think the narrative would have been, oh, this is such a razor-thin majority. Everybody has to fall in line. Mark Carney has to keep his caucus, his MPs very, very happy because if one or two are unhappy, they will leave. Now it's the opposite. It's basically they will hold together and they will try to attract votes from elsewhere. I think it's a good scenario for Mark Carney.
I wouldn't say it's
are you
as
a
good as a
spin
majority.
doctor and you're part-time, Philippe?
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's as good as a majority. I don't know if, like, as Philippe says, if they'd won 172 or 173, that wouldn't have made too much of a difference. If you have a big majority, that's usually better. It means you have more control of what's happening in the House of Commons. You have more control over committees. The fact that they're going to be short of a majority will make it a bit more complicated for those kinds of things because they won't be able to just railroad the other parties in committee, won't be able to shut down debate in the House of Commons. But the reason why this is one that could last, and most minority governments in Canada only last about 18 months, the fact that the last one lasted nearly 4 years was an exception, is that the other parties are just not really in the mood for an election. The NDP doesn't have a leader now because their leader stepped down. They have to have a leadership race. The party is going to be dead broke. Because they did so bad, they won't get some of their election expenses reimbursed, which is how it works in Canada. Yeah, if you get a certain threshold of the vote, you get your election expenses reimbursed. So they're going to be in just dire financial straits. So they're not going to want an election. So in a way, Mark Carney can almost force them to support his agenda, or at least not vote against the party, because they could just absent themselves, and then the NDP, the Liberals would have their majority. The Bloc doesn't really want an election either. There's a Quebec election next year, so they don't want to get in the way of that. And the Conservatives maybe would want an election, but I don't think anybody else wants to give it to them. So the Liberals can kind of play chicken with the other parties for probably a decent amount of time. I don't know if this one will last for 4 years, but I would be shocked if it fell within the next year and a half or 2 years, which is the historical length of these governments.
This election, as we've discussed, was waged in many ways over Trump. Is that how the government that has now won the election, is that how they're going to govern? Are domestic issues going to come roaring back and make Mark Carney's Liberal government immediately unpopular because there will still be a cost of living crisis and there will still be debates over immigration and trade and all of these things? I know that Carney is meeting with Trump very soon, and so for now, Trump will remain the focus. But what happens next?
I think that while it's not going to be about Trump, it's the background, because Mark Carney has set a couple different priorities, bringing down interprovincial trade barriers. We have lots of those. Making sure that we have more partners outside of the United States for trade. So his whole thing is more or less strengthening the Canadian economy so that it can withstand the uncertainty from the United States and doesn't have to be as reliant on the United States. So while it's not necessarily going to be all about Trump, I think Carney is actually going to take much more of a, now that he's in office, he's going to try to take a much more collaborative approach to try to actually cooperate and get things done. I think the background of it is always going to be that, okay, we used to rely on the United States. We can't rely on them anymore. So we need to be more self-sufficient. And that means making our economy more resilient. So I think that the theme is still Trump inspired, but I don't think it's going to be an anti-Trump government in that sense.
I agree. There's no benefit to being an anti-Trump government except during a campaign. Yeah. When you have to govern, I mean, you have to find a way to get along and to have, those merchandise go across the border without tariffs, without hassle. And to what you said, just Galen, the cost of living. Well, thing is, if there are tariffs and there are layoffs and if there's inflation and there's the cost of living cannot be divorced from that. If we have massive layoffs in Ontario in the auto sectors, in Quebec with the aluminum and steel industries, cost of living will enter that fray. So I'm very, very curious to see what the near future holds. Perhaps it's going to get settled. But I know there's unease in Canadian government right now, because even if they negotiated no deal with Trump, what Trump wants to do, he says at least, who says that he's going to respect that deal that he signs? That's the thing. Like there may
Sign the last one.
Yeah, there may not be a free trade deal in the near future, because we don't know if once the signature is put there, the president will respect it.
Lastly, and relatedly, when we spoke in March, a poll had just been released from Leger showing that only 33% of Canadians had a favorable view of the United States, and as many as 27% saw the United States as an enemy. Has that changed at all over the past 2 months?
I don't think we've seen any indication in the polling, at least, that views of the United States have improved over the last little while. They're still pretty rock bottom. I just saw one poll, and the United States was still more popular than Russia, China, North Korea, but that's about it.
Yeah.
I think there is still lots of work to do. I do think that the initial kind of emotive reaction to it has dissipated a little bit. Like, I'm not sure if the anthem is being booed as lustily at the hockey games anymore. I think that people kind of gotten over a little bit of that. But I don't think views of the United States have improved very greatly, because Donald Trump is still very unpopular. I know that his approval rating has been slipping in the United States. It's been slipping even here in Canada, and it was already pretty low, but we do see that it's not getting any better. But I do think that maybe Canadians have girded themselves a little bit, and maybe they're a little bit less emotionally reacting to what's happening in the United States.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's hardening right now. It's not as emotional, but I think many Canadians, and to have spoken, many anecdotes add up, right? I know many Canadians have canceled vacation this summer in the United States. Just go, you know what, we're not going to go. And perhaps when your Airbnbs near the border are all empty and snowbirds stop going to Florida, well, we're gonna find a new place to go if that doesn't get resolved. But I still view Americans as friends, but not trading partner anymore.
Okay, all right, fair enough. Well, I guess hopefully I'll still be able to sell you on a GD Politics subscription, if not on aluminum or timber or whatever else it may be. But anyway, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you sharing your time.
All right, thanks a lot, Galen.
Thank you, Galen. Take care.
My name is Galen Druke. I'm in the early days of getting this podcast off the ground, and I appreciate your support in any way possible. Subscribe to GD Politics wherever you get your podcasts, and if you'd be so kind to rate and review us, maybe even tell a friend. Also importantly, subscribe to the Substack at gdpolitics.com. There you'll get updates on what we're doing, extras, and you can support this project directly. Thanks so much for listening, and we will see you soon.